13. Sultan Mehmed III, 1595 to 1603, the last warrior on the throne. When Mehmed III ascended the Ottoman throne in 1595, the empire still stretched from Hungary to the Persian frontier, its banners glinting beneath a weary sun. Yet beneath that splendor, something fragile stirred: fear. To secure his claim, the young sultan followed the brutal law of fratricide. 19 of his brothers were strangled with silken cords in a single night. The echoes of their deaths would haunt his reign, a chilling reminder that even victory demanded blood. Beyond the palace walls, Europe burned. The long war with the Habsburgs raged across the Danube plains. Armies clashed amid fog and thunder, and the once invincible Janissaries now questioned their commanders. But in 1596, on the fields near Haçova, fate offered one last moment of Ottoman glory. Against overwhelming odds, Mehmed rode into battle himself, an act unseen since the age of Suleiman. When his standard-bearers faltered, he seized the banner and charged forward, his presence igniting the ranks. The Christian alliance broke. The imperial camp roared with triumph. Yet the victory at Haçova was both dazzling and deceptive. Behind the drums of war, corruption festered. Soldiers went unpaid, governors carved their own fiefdoms, and the treasury thinned under endless campaigns. Within the palace, Valide Sultan Safai, his formidable mother, ruled the court with ruthless grace, weaving webs of intrigue that blurred where authority truly lay. In his final years, Mehmed retreated into seclusion. The warrior who had led men into battle became a shadow haunted by guilt and exhaustion. He died in 1603, leaving behind an empire that had won its last great battlefield triumph, yet lost something far greater: its balance between power and purpose. The age of the conquering sultans was ending. A more fragile, uncertain era was about to begin. '14. Sultan Ahmed I, 1603 to 1617. The young dreamer and the Blue Mosque. When Ahmed I took the throne, he was barely 13, a boy inheriting an empire trembling beneath its own weight. The blood of 19 brothers still stained the marble corridors of Topkapi, and the memory of his father's cruelty lingered in every whisper of the court. Yet this young sultan, gentle and devout, sought to lead differently. Where others ruled through fear, he longed for grace. Where others built empires with the sword, he wished to build something eternal with faith. From the first days of his reign, Ahmed broke the grim tradition of fratricide. For the first time in Ottoman history, the heir to the throne, his brother Mustafa, was spared. This act of mercy sent a quiet tremor through the empire. Perhaps compassion could coexist with sovereignty. Yet mercy came at a cost. Factions within the palace began to stir, sensing weakness where once there had only been terror. The young sultan's rule would become a constant struggle between his moral vision and the brutal machinery of empire. But Ahmed's legacy would not be written in blood, it would be etched in stone. On the hills of old Byzantium, he envisioned a structure that would rival the Hagia Sophia, not as a symbol of conquest, but of devotion. Thus rose the Sultan Ahmed Mosque, known to the world as the Blue Mosque, a symphony of domes and minarets shimmering under the Istanbul sky. Its walls were adorned with over 20,000 blue Iznik tiles, their patterns echoing paradise itself. Within its great dome, light poured like divine breath through 260 windows. Each prayer offered beneath its arches was a whisper of hope in an age of exhaustion. Yet beyond its beauty, the world still demanded war. The empire fought on distant fronts, against the Habsburgs in Europe, the Safavids in Persia, and victory grew ever more elusive. The treasury strained, the Janissaries murmured, and the boy who dreamed of peace began to wither under the weight of expectation. Ahmed I died young, at 27, his health broken but his soul serene. The Blue Mosque stood completed, its domes reaching heavenward like his unfulfilled dreams. In the centuries to come, pilgrims would walk its courtyards and whisper his name, not as a conqueror, but as a sultan who dared to believe that beauty and faith could heal an empire's wounded heart. '15. Sultan Mustafa I, 1617 to 1623. The Ghost of the Golden Cage. When Sultan Ahmed I died in 1617, the empire faced a dilemma it had never encountered before. The late sultan's sons were mere children, too young to rule an empire trembling on the edge of disorder. And so, in an unprecedented act, the court turned not to a son, but to a brother, Mustafa I, a man who had spent most of his life imprisoned in the caves, the palace's gilded cage for potential heirs. For 14 long years, Mustafa had lived in isolation, a prince denied the sun. His world was a silent room, his companions, shadows and fear. When he was suddenly pulled from confinement and crowned sultan, the empire itself seemed to shudder. He was not prepared. How could he be? The man who walked out of the cage was fragile, trembling, and bewildered by the light. Servants whispered that he spoke to ghosts, that he ordered pigeons released in the palace gardens so that the spirits of his dead nephews might find peace. Behind the marble walls of Topkapi, real power shifted elsewhere. The Valide Sultan, Ahmed's formidable mother, and Grand Vizier Sofu Mehmed Pasha became the true rulers, steering a court already divided between reformers and opportunists. In the provinces, chaos grew. The Janissaries, once the disciplined sword of the empire, had become unpredictable, their loyalty a thing to be purchased, not earned. In 1618, barely a year into his reign, Mustafa was deposed. His young nephew Osman II, bold and ambitious, took the throne. Yet the wheel of fate turned again. When Osman was murdered in 1622 by his own soldiers, the terrified court restored Mustafa, believing that his madness might be safer than another young dreamer's ambition. His second reign was a ghostly echo of the first. The empire drifted, rudderless, as viziers fought over influence and power. The sultan wandered the palace corridors muttering prayers and names long forgotten. He was no tyrant, no hero, only a symbol of an empire uncertain of its own future, clinging to rituals it no longer understood. In 1623, Mustafa was quietly removed once more. He returned to the silence of the cage from which he'd come, his reigns like two brief flickers of a dying candle. History remembers him not for what he did, but for what his life revealed, that even the greatest empire on earth could no longer guarantee strength nor reason in its rulers. 16. Sultan Osman II, 1618 to 1622. The dreamer who challenged the Janissaries. From the chaos of Mustafa's fragile rule emerged a boy who believed he could restore the empire's greatness. Osman II, just 16 when he ascended the throne, possessed a fierce intelligence and the burning conviction that the Ottoman spirit could still be reborn. He had grown up studying tales of Mehmed the Conqueror and Suleiman the Magnificent, and he dreamed of carving his own legend into that golden lineage. But he ruled a very different empire now, one weary, fragmented, and ruled as much by the whims of the Janissaries as by the will of the Sultan. Osman's first test came on the battlefield. In 1621, he marched north against the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, determined to reclaim lost prestige. The campaign led to the Battle of Chosin, Khotan, where Ottoman and Polish forces clashed for weeks amid mud, hunger, and exhaustion. Osman fought bravely, but his army, undisciplined, starving, and ill-led by corrupt officers, refused to break the Polish defense. The young Sultan witnessed firsthand the decay of the once mighty Ottoman war machine. When he returned to Istanbul, he carried not only defeat, but revelation. The empire could no longer survive with an army that defied its own ruler. Determined to reform, Osman set his sights on the Janissaries, those elite soldiers who had once been the empire's pride, but had become its greatest liability. He dreamed of replacing them with a new corps, loyal only to the Sultan, recruited from Anatolia's heartland. In secret, he planned a pilgrimage to Mecca under the pretense of piety, but in truth to gather support for his reformist vision. Yet the palace was a house of echoes, and secrets never stayed hidden for long. The Janissaries heard the whispers, and their pride curdled into rage. In May 1622, they rose in rebellion. The streets of Istanbul shook with gunfire and screams as the mob stormed Topkapi Palace. Osman fled, But there was no refuge left for a reformer in an empire afraid of change. The boy sultan, the dreamer who sought renewal, was dragged into the Yedikul fortress, the Seven Towers. There, in the dark, he was beaten, humiliated, and strangled by the very soldiers he had hoped to reform. He was just 18 years old. Osman II became the first Ottoman Sultan killed by his own army. His death sent a chill through the empire's soul. The age of fearless rulers had given way to an age of fear itself. From that moment on, every sultan would reign beneath the shadow of the Janissary's wrath. 17. Sultan Murad IV, 1623 to 1640, the Iron Sultan. When Osman II was murdered, the empire shuddered. The throne had become a perilous seat, one that devoured youth, faith, and dreams alike. From this chaos emerged another boy, just 11 years old, Murad IV, the son of Ahmed I. The empire was in flames. The Safavids pressed from the east, rebellious governors rose in Anatolia, and the Janissaries, drunk with power, ruled the streets of Istanbul. For years, Murad was sultan in name only. Behind him, his mother, the formidable Kozum Sultan, governed through cunning and survival. The child who sat on the throne watched as the empire fractured before his eyes. But the boy would not remain silent forever. By his late teens, Murad had transformed from a timid figurehead into a force of terrifying will. He witnessed betrayal, weakness, and corruption, and swore to crush them all. When he seized full control in the 1630s, the city trembled. The Iron Sultan had arrived. Murad ruled with absolute authority, and his first decree was fear. He banned wine, tobacco, and coffee, symbols of a decadent and lawless age. Yet he did not merely issue commands from the palace. He prowled the streets at night in disguise, sword in hand, executing lawbreakers himself. Chroniclers wrote of a ruler who could appear from the shadows like divine wrath. Under his rule, silence returned to Istanbul, not the silence of peace, but of obedience. In 1638, Murad sought to redeem the empire's honor with conquest. He led his army east to Baghdad, long held by the Safavids. The campaign was brutal and decisive. The Ottoman cannons roared through the Mesopotamian plains, and after 40 days, the ancient city fell. Murad entered Baghdad in triumph, restoring the empire's pride and earning his place among its warrior kings. Yet beneath his victories, there was darkness. The Sultan's paranoia deepened. His court became a maze of spies and executions. No one, not vizier, not prince, was beyond suspicion. He returned to Istanbul ill and exhausted, consumed by the very power he had fought to control. In 1640, Murad IV died at just 27, leaving behind a realm disciplined but scarred, orderly but hollow. His reign had restored the empire's surface strength, but beneath the steel lay rot and fear. For the first time in generations, the Ottomans had known stability, but at a cost so heavy it nearly crushed their spirit. And as the Iron Sultan was laid to rest, a new, far darker chapter awaited: the Age of Madness. 18. Sultan Ibrahim, 1640 to 1648. The Mad Sultan and the Fall of Reason. When the Iron Sultan, Murad IV, died in 1640, his only surviving brother was dragged from the caves, the palace cage. That brother was Ibrahim, a man who had spent most of his life imprisoned in darkness, certain he would be executed like the countless princes before him. The day he was told his brother was dead, he refused to believe it. Terrified of a trick, he hid behind doors, screaming that Murad still lived and would come for him. Only after being shown his brother's corpse did he emerge, shaking, hollow-eyed, and utterly broken. That was the man who became sultan. At first, there was hope. The empire, exhausted from Murad's iron rule, longed for relief. Under the watchful eye of Kozum Sultan, his mother, the court moved cautiously. For a brief moment, the air softened. Executions slowed, foreign envoys were received, trade resumed. But the scars of the cage ran too deep. The isolation that had kept Ibrahim alive had also driven him to the edge of madness. Paranoia and obsession soon took hold. He distrusted his viziers, replaced ministers at whim, and lavished impossible wealth on his favorites. Among them was a concubine known as Sekerper, the sweet peace, who wielded influence over the sultan like a spell. He filled the palace with silks, perfumes, and jewels, drowning in sensual excess while the empire's provinces bled. The treasury emptied, taxes soared, and whispers of insanity echoed through Istanbul. Foreign envoys wrote of strange scenes within Topkapi, the sultan ordering an entire fleet to search for a mythical golden fish, demanding fur-lined garments in summer, releasing doves as messengers to the spirits of his dead brothers. The line between grief and delusion vanished, and while the court indulged, the empire cracked. The Venetians advanced in the Mediterranean, the Safavids stirred in the east, and within the palace, Kozum struggled to hold the center. By 1648, the Janissaries had seen enough. Their patience, already thin after decades of chaos, broke. They surrounded Topkapi Palace, demanding Ibrahim's removal. The Divan declared him unfit to rule. As the soldiers burst through the gates, the once mighty descendant of Osman was dragged from his chambers. In August, he was strangled with the same silken cord that had ended so many before him. He was remembered as Ibrahim the Mad, but his madness was not born in power, it was born in fear. Fear of death, of the cage, of the impossible legacy of his ancestors. His reign marked the moment when the Ottoman crown, once the world's most formidable symbol of order, became a mirror of the empire's own unraveling soul. 19. Sultan Mehmed IV, 1648 to 1687. The Hunter and the Fall of Vienna. When Sultan Ibrahim was strangled, the empire was leaderless, hollowed by fear and scandal. Onto the throne came his 7-year-old son, Mehmed IV, a child whose wide eyes reflected both innocence and exhaustion. The empire that crowned him was no longer the roaring giant of Suleiman's day. It was an aging colossus staggering beneath its own weight. For 2 decades, viziers and queen mothers ruled in his name while he watched, learned, and waited. Out of this chaos rose a family of reformers, the Copperless, whose brilliance would momentarily revive the empire's dying heart. First came Copperlu Mehmed Pasha, an administrator of iron will who demanded absolute authority and, against all odds, received it. In a single decade, he purged corruption, crushed rebellions, rearmed the navy, and filled the treasury. Under his son Fazıl Ahmed Pasha, Ottoman banners once again advanced across Europe. Crete fell after a siege of 24 years. Hungary's plains echoed with the thunder of Ottoman hooves. For a fleeting moment, the empire glimmered with the illusion of renewal. Mehmed IV, nicknamed Avsi the Hunter, preferred falcons and forests to politics. He roamed the countryside in magnificent hunting processions, his bow drawn while statesmen rebuilt his empire behind the scenes. Yet he was not without vision. He restored religious discipline, supported the ulama, and projected a stern moral order. To his subjects, he seemed a pious monarch presiding over a world once again in balance. But destiny was already sharpening its blade. By the early 1680s, the empire's ambition turned westward once more, to the walls of Vienna, the same city that had defied Suleiman a century before. The Grand Vizier Kara Mustafa Pasha, a man of towering pride, led an army of nearly 150,000 toward the heart of Europe. On the fields outside Vienna in 1683, Ottoman cannons thundered for 2 months. Victory seemed certain, until the dawn of September 12th, when King John III Sobieski of Poland descended from the Kahlenberg Hills with his cavalry. The charge shattered the Ottoman lines. What began as triumph ended in catastrophe. The defeat at Vienna was more than a lost battle. It was the shattering of an illusion. The empire that had once encircled Europe now stood on the defensive. Hungary slipped away, morale crumbled, and the Janissaries turned on their leaders. In 1687, as rebellions flared and armies collapsed, the soldiers stormed Topkapi once more. The Sultan, the hunter who had ruled for nearly 40 years, was deposed by his own troops and sent into exile. When Mehmed IV left the palace for the last time, falcons perched silently on their stands, their hoods drawn. The empire he left behind still stood vast, but its soul had changed forever. The dream of endless conquest had died outside Vienna's walls. From that moment on, the Ottomans would fight not for glory, but for survival. 20. Sultan Suleiman II, 1687 to 1691. The flicker in the storm. The throne that Suleiman II inherited in 1687 was not the seat of an empire, it was the eye of a hurricane. The humiliating defeat at Vienna had torn the Ottoman dream apart. Rebellions raged in Anatolia, soldiers mutinied in the streets, and foreign armies closed in from the north and west. The once mighty state, proud heir of Mehmed the Conqueror, now seemed like a wounded beast surrounded by hunters. Suleiman was 50 when he became sultan, an age of reflection, not ambition. For most of his life, he had been a ghost behind palace walls, a forgotten prince locked in the caves, where time moved slowly and fear never slept. When the Janissaries dragged his brother Mehmed IV from the throne, they placed the reluctant Suleiman upon it, hoping he would be pliable, perhaps weak. Instead, he surprised them. Though cautious and melancholic, he possessed a quiet dignity and a genuine desire to heal the empire's wounds. He turned to the only men who could save it, the Copperless, that dynasty of viziers who had once revived Ottoman glory. The new Grand Vizier, Copperlu Fazıl Mustafa Pasha, became his right hand. Together, they sought to impose order amid ruin. Corruption was punished, soldiers were paid, and the treasury slowly refilled. The empire's armies, though battered, rallied once more on the Danube frontier. In 1689, Ottoman banners marched toward Belgrade, seeking to reclaim what had been lost. The campaigns were brutal and uncertain, but the spirit of command returned. Even as disease ravaged the camps and defeat hovered near, Suleiman refused despair. He prayed daily, fasted often, and lived with an almost monastic restraint, an image of faith in an age of disillusion. To his people, he became a symbol not of victory, but of endurance, a sultan who faced decline with grace. Yet time was not on his side. Years of confinement had left his body frail. In 1691, as the empire prepared for another desperate stand against the Austrian Habsburgs, Suleiman fell ill. He died that same year before the armies could march. He left behind no grand monuments, no conquests carved in marble, only a fragile sense of dignity reclaimed from chaos. The empire he tried to steady would soon tremble again. But in the long shadow cast by failure, Suleiman too glowed like a single candle, small, flickering, yet refusing to go out. 21. Sultan Ahmed II, 1691 to 1695, the Emperor of Exhaustion. When Ahmed II ascended the Ottoman throne in 1691, the empire was a battlefield without borders. Europe's powers, the Austrians, Venetians, and Poles, pressed in from every direction. The once terrifying Ottoman armies, broken by years of defeat and corruption, now fought not for conquest, but for survival. Ahmed II was no warrior prince. He was a man of quiet faith, already past his prime, summoned from the shadows of the palace to rule an empire drowning in turmoil. Yet beside him stood a glimmer of hope, Copperlu Fazıl Mustafa Pasha, the last great statesman of his dynasty. The Grand Vizier was tireless, a reformer who sought to rebuild morale and discipline amid chaos. Together, Sultan and Vizier became unlikely partners. Ahmed, the devout and reflective sovereign. Mustafa, the iron administrator who wielded the sword and the pen with equal precision. For a time, it seemed the empire might breathe again. The army, reorganized and rejuvenated, marched north to challenge the Habsburgs once more. In 1691, they met near Slankamen, a battle that would decide the fate of the Balkans. Under the blazing summer sun, Ottoman cannons thundered across the plains. For hours, the tide swung back and forth until an Austrian musket ball struck the heart of the Ottoman command, killing the Grand Vizier Fazıl Mustafa. The army broke. The Danube frontier collapsed. Ahmed II received the news in silence. He wept, not as a sultan, But as a man who knew that with Mustafa's death, the last true architect of Ottoman power was gone. Still, he refused despair. He focused on governance, repairing roads, protecting trade routes, and easing taxes on the war-torn provinces. Chroniclers noted his gentleness, his patience, and his refusal to execute even those who failed him. But mercy could not mend a bleeding empire. By 1695, age and illness overtook him. As he lay dying, European diplomats carved Ottoman territories into new frontiers. Hungary was gone. Transylvania slipped away. The empire that had once ruled 3 continents was shrinking like a receding tide. Ahmed II died in quiet dignity, uncelebrated but uncorrupted. History would remember him as a man who ruled during the storm, but did not lose his soul to it. His reign marked the twilight of the old Ottoman world, a flicker of conscience amid the exhaustion of an empire that had forgotten how to rest. 22. Sultan Mustafa II, 1695 to 1703. The last ride of the warrior sultans. When Mustafa II took the throne in 1695, he did so not as a caretaker, but as a man determined to reclaim the empire's lost honor. The echoes of defeat still hung heavy over Istanbul. Vienna had fallen decades before, Hungary was gone, and the Danube frontier, once the empire's proud border, had turned into a line of retreat. But Mustafa, young and resolute, refused to accept decline as destiny. He would be the first sultan in generations to lead his armies personally, to ride once more at the head of his men as the warrior kings of old. Within months of his coronation, he marched north against the Austrians, reclaiming fortresses along the Danube. The victories at Lugos, 1695, and Alish, 1696, rekindled a dying flame. Chroniclers wrote of the Sultan's golden armor glinting in the sun, of his presence on the field restoring courage to men who had forgotten pride. For a moment, it seemed as if the age of conquest might return. Yet the world around him had changed. The Ottoman war machine that once terrified Europe now faced enemies united, modernized, and relentless. In 1697, the 2 great armies met again at Zenta, on the banks of the Tisa River. The Ottoman forces were crossing a bridge when the Prince of Savoy, Eugene of Savoy, struck without mercy. Caught between the river and the enemy, chaos consumed them. Thousands drowned. The rest were slaughtered. The bridge of Zenta became a tomb of empire. It was one of the most disastrous defeats in Ottoman history. The loss broke more than armies. It broke the illusion of invincibility. The Treaty of Karlowitz, 1699, soon followed, forcing the empire to surrender vast territories. Hungary, Transylvania, Podolia, and parts of Dalmatia. For the first time, the Ottomans signed a treaty acknowledging defeat to European powers. It was a wound not just of land, but of pride. In the years that followed, Mustafa II turned inward. He sought solace in faith, in poetry, and in the quiet companionship of his gardens at Edirne. He withdrew from Istanbul, preferring the countryside where he could pretend, if only for a while, that the empire still belonged to its sultans, not to its soldiers or viziers. But rebellion brewed even there. In 1703, the Edirne incident, a mutiny of soldiers and scholars, forced him to abdicate. As he left the throne, Mustafa looked back one last time at the empire he had tried to save. He had fought with courage, ruled with conviction, and failed with dignity. His reign marked the end of an era, the last sultan to ride into battle, the final echo of the age when the Ottoman banner meant conquest. After him, the sword would give way to the pen, and the empire's battles would be fought not on fields, but in courts and treaties. '23. Sultan Ahmed III, 1703 to 1730. The Tulip Emperor and the Illusion of Paradise. When Mustafa II was forced from the throne, the empire stood at a crossroads between ruin and rebirth. Into this fragile world stepped his brother, Ahmed III, a man of refinement, poetry, and paradox. He ascended the throne in 1703 amid the chaos of the Edirne Revolt, which had torn the capital apart. The soldiers who placed him on the throne demanded stability, not dreams. Yet Ahmed would give them both order first and then beauty. From the beginning, his reign carried a different tone. Gone were the cries of conquest and the clang of swords. Instead came the murmur of fountains, the rustle of silks, and the laughter of poets in candlelit gardens. Under his rule, Istanbul blossomed into a city of light. This was the Tulip Era, a time when the empire, weary from centuries of blood, turned its gaze inward toward art, pleasure, and refinement. Tulips became the symbol of everything Ottoman elegance aspired to be. Fragile yet eternal, exotic yet deeply rooted. In the palace of Sadabid, Ahmed hosted moonlit festivals where music and poetry floated over the Bosphorus. Scholars translated French texts. Architects built graceful pavilions influenced by European design. The printing press arrived, imported by Ibrahim Mutefarrika, marking a hesitant step toward modernization. Diplomats in powdered wigs mingled with scholars in turbans. The empire, for the first time, seemed curious about the world beyond its borders. But beauty is a fragile mask, and beneath it festered resentment. The elite lived in opulence while the people bore the weight of taxation and inflation. The janissaries, stripped of influence, simmered with anger. Preachers warned that the Sultan's indulgence betrayed the faith of his ancestors. Still, Ahmed listened more to the music of his gardens than the murmurs of unrest. In 1730, the illusion shattered. A humble Albanian bathhouse worker named Patrona Halil ignited a riot that consumed Istanbul. Enraged crowds stormed the palaces, destroying the symbols of the Tulip Era's success. Fires blazed where fountains once sang. Mehmed III, stunned by the ferocity of the uprising, abdicated rather than see more blood spilled. As he left Topkapi Palace, the tulip fields were trampled, their petals scattered like memories of a dream too delicate for the world. Ahmed's reign was remembered as a paradox, an age of peace that led to chaos, a bloom that withered at its peak. Yet in that brief, dazzling season, he proved that even an empire in decline could still create beauty to rival its former glory. The age of swords was gone. The age of illusions had begun. 24. Sultan Mahmud I, 1730 to 1754, the restorer in the ashes. When the fires of the Patrona Halil rebellion faded, the Ottoman Empire lay bruised and bewildered. The tulip gardens were gone, the laughter of poets silenced, and the once radiant palaces stood scarred by smoke. Into this silence stepped Mahmud I, the nephew of Ahmed III, a man quiet in demeanor, tempered by caution, yet carrying a rare gift, the will to restore balance without illusion. He was enthroned amid chaos, chosen by the same mob that had overthrown his uncle. The rebels prowled the streets, demanding spoils and appointments. But Mahmud, though soft-spoken, possessed steel beneath his calm. Slowly, patiently, he regained control. Within months, the ringleader Patrona Halil was executed in the very audience chamber he once dominated. The empire exhaled. The nightmare was over, but the dream was gone. Mahmud's reign began not with ambition, but with recovery. He rebuilt what had been destroyed: palaces, mosques, and, most importantly, authority. He surrounded himself with capable viziers and sought stability above all else. He knew that glory could wait, but order could not. For the first time in generations, the empire found a rhythm again. Tax reforms were implemented, trade reopened, and diplomacy softened old enmities. Yet peace in the Ottoman world was never still for long. The Persians, under the fiery conqueror Nader Shah, rose from the east, challenging Ottoman control in Iraq and the Caucasus. Mahmud's generals fought a cautious, grinding war, trading victory and loss like breath. In the west, Austrian and Russian ambitions stirred once more. The Sultan, understanding the limits of his power, turned to alliances and negotiation, a pragmatism born of centuries of overreach. But while armies clashed at the edges, within Istanbul, Mahmud rebuilt the empire's soul. He reopened schools, funded calligraphers and scholars, and filled the capital once more with the quiet hum of culture. The Topkapi Palace, though diminished, pulsed again with the measured dignity of governance. Chroniclers described Mahmud as a ruler who preferred the pen to the sword, yet never forgot how to wield both. He ruled for nearly a quarter of a century, longer than any of his immediate predecessors. His reign was neither glorious nor infamous. It was steady, patient, and deeply human. When Mahmud I died in 1754, he left behind an empire not reborn, but breathing again. Its wounds tended, its pride tempered. The age of empire's fury had ended. What remained was endurance, the quiet strength to survive. From the blood-soaked fields of Haçova to the gardens of Sadabid and the ashes of rebellion, the Ottoman world had completed its descent from conquest to contemplation. Mahmud I closed an era, not with the clang of battle, but with a sigh of resilience. The sun had dimmed, yes, but it had not gone out. As Mahmud I's reign drew to a close, the Ottoman Empire no longer burned with the fire of conquest. It glowed with the quiet strength of endurance. From the ashes of Sadabid to the domes of Topkapi, he proved that true power lies not in the sword, but in the courage to keep the flame alive. Yet this is not the end. After Mahmud I, a new chapter begins, where decline and reform intertwine, and future sultans must choose between the echoes of glory and the uncertainty of survival. Stay tuned for the next episode, as we continue the epic story of the Ottoman Sultans, only on PHT History.